The girl they were bullying was a snake, if only the bullies knew. It all started in the halls of Willow Creek High School, which burst with the usual teenage energy, a arm of laughter, gossip, and the occasional sound of lockers slamming shut. It was a typical school day, but there was something unsettling beneath the surface, a new undercurrent of tension that had arrived with the school's latest transfer student, Sandra. Sandra was unlike any other student. She moved with quiet grace, her steps light, as if she were barely touching the ground. Her skin was an unusual shade, as if touched by a faint shimmer in satin lights, almost golden in the sun and cool as stone in the shade. Her most distinctive feature, though, was her eyes, deep green, with pupils that seemed to narrow in the light, like a predator's. A few students had noticed this strange trait, and rumors were already spreading. Some said she had contacts, while others whispered she was hiding something sinister. The whispers never reached her directly, but Sandra was keenly aware of the distance that had formed between her and her classmates. She didn't mind it. She had come to Willow Creek with one goal: to keep her true nature hidden. Her grandmother, the one person in the world who understood her, had warned her about the dangers of exposure. Sandra came from an ancient lineage, a bloodline touched by the spirits of snakes. It was a heritage that ran in her family, passed down from mother to daughter, and Sandra had been the next in line to receive the gifts, or curse, as she sometimes thought of it. While she could blend in with humans, there was a part of her that was always coiled, tense, waiting. Keeping that part hidden was both a survival instinct and a necessity. Her grandmother, the only one who knew the full truth, had raised her to move through the world like a shadow, unseen and untouched. Stay unnoticed, Sandra. Her grandmother had said, let them think you are hot if they must, but don't let them see the truth, she added. At first, things were relatively smooth. Sandra kept to herself, sitting alone at lunch and focusing on her studies. She didn't make an effort to speak with others, and while some students cast her curious glances, no one seemed particularly inclined to reach out. That was until Sabrina noticed. Sabrina was everything Sandra wasn't: loud, confident, and obsessed with maintaining her position as the queen bee. With her stylish clothes, flawless hair, and circle of friends that seemed to orbit her like planets around the sun, Sabrina was untouchable. She knew it, and she thrived on the control that she had over her peers. To Sabrina, Sandra was an oddity, a strange, quiet girl who didn't seem to understand the social rules that governed Willow Creek High, and for that, Sabrina despised her. It started subtly at first, with Sabrina and her friends making snide remarks whenever Sandra walked by. "It's like so weird. Have you seen her eyes? Have you seen the color?" Sabrina would say, her voice just loud enough to be heard, setting off giggles from her friends. Sandra felt the sting of their words, but forced herself to remain calm. She had endured worse, and would endure this too. But Sabrina wasn't one to leave things half finished. She began to escalate her attacks, knocking Sandra's book from her hands as she passed in the hallways, sticking her with ridiculous nicknames like Lizard Girl or Creepy Sandra. Sandra tried to ignore it, focusing on her grandmother's words of caution. She knew that the anger simmering in her veins was dangerous, that it had the potential to awaken something that could not be easily controlled. Still, every time Sabrina shoved her, every mocking whisper, every look of disgust made it harder to keep her true self contained. One day, Sabrina decided to make her disdain even more public. As Sandra was walking to her locker, Sabrina and her friends cornered her, blocking her path. Sabrina's eyes sparkled with a cruel excitement, as though she had been waiting for this moment. "Hello, green eyes," Sabrina sneered, her voice dripping with mockery. "Where are your other coven members? Or do you slither alone?" Her friends burst into laughter, their voices sharp and piercing. Sandra felt her hands tighten around the straps of her backpack, her pulse quickening. She could feel the surge of something cold and ancient stirring within her, a presence that eased softly, urging her to let go, to transform into a snake figure. Sandra's expression remained calm, but inwardly, she was struggling to keep her control. Her vision sharpened, and she was acutely aware of Sabrina's scent, the distinct smell of perfume mingling with something sour, something that a serpent instinct identified as fear, masked by arrogance. She could see the quickened beats of Sabrina's pulse in her neck, the slight trembling of her fingers. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Not yet, she thought. Not yet. She wasn't ready to risk everything. Not over Sabrina, not over something so petty. With one last look into Sabrina's eyes, Sandra stepped aside, moving past her and disappearing down the hallway. Sabrina and her friends continued to laugh, mocking her, but Sandra was already focused on something deeper. She could feel her inner self written beneath her skin, a quiet promise of what she could unleash if she truly wanted to. So, she just had to walk away. As she walked away, she made a silent vow. If Sabrina pushed her too far, if her cruelty went beyond words and small acts of bullying, she would finally allow herself to strike. But for now, she would bide her time, letting the tension coil within her, waiting for the moment when her patience would snap and her true nature would be revealed in the shadows. Sandra thought about the bullying. It didn't start suddenly. It built up over weeks, a quiet, insidious escalation that crept into Sandra's life like a poison she could neither identify nor stop. Sabrina, the self-proclaimed Queen Bee of Willow Creek High School, was always watching for an opportunity to establish her dominance. She had marked Sandra as a target the moment the strange, quiet girl walked into the school, and she intended to make Sandra's life as difficult as possible. Sometimes, Sabrina would swing a backpack just wide enough to hit Sandra's shoulder as she passed by, muttering a sarcastic oops. Before smacking over her shoulder, Sandra kept her head down, gripping her books tightly, telling herself it would pass. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, reminding her to keep calm, stay unnoticed, not to let her true nature show. She had kept herself hidden for years. She could endure this too, Sandra said to herself. But Sabrina's torment only grew worse. The whispers and casual bumps soon turned into something more calculated. Sabrina enlisted two of her closest friends, Carly and Beth, who were more than happy to join in. They began to single Sandra out at lunch, sitting themselves near a table and accidentally spilling drinks nearby, sometimes drenching her books or clothes. One afternoon, Carly even reached over and grabbed Sandra's notebook, holding it just out of her reach, while she laughed. "What is the matter, ugly girl? Are you scared to ease at me?" Carly teased, her tone dripping with mockery. Sandra felt a cold rage simmering within her, a tingling at the base of her spine that she recognized as a warning. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. She simply sat there, letting Carly and Beth laugh as they tore pages from her notebook. Sabrina watched from across the table, her expression smug, as if she were conducting the entire scene from a throne. Sabrina's next move was even more public. After a week of tormenting Sandra in the cafeteria, and always, she orchestrated an incident in the science lab. Sandra was carefully setting up her materials for an experiment when Sabrina bumped into her, knocking the equipment to the floor. Glass shattered, chemicals spilled, and Sabrina feigned shock, raising her voice for everyone to hear. "Sandra, can't you be more careful? Or are your scaly hands too clumsy for basic science?" she mocked. The other students laughed, and Sandra clenched her fists, feeling the urge to strike. She could see Sabrina smirk, the glint of triumph in her eyes, daring her to react. She forced herself to stay still, to keep her emotions in check, but her pulse was racing, and she knew she was close to her breaking point. She could feel the familiar prickling sensation that signaled the transformation lurking beneath her skin, ready to emerge. That evening, Sandra returned home in a silent rage, her body tense and her mind racing. Her grandmother noticed, her sharp eyes catching the telltale signs, the narrowed pupils, the faint shimmer under Sandra's skin. She gently took Sandra's hands, her voice soft but firm. "You must not give in, Sandra. They are not worth it." "I know, grandmother," Sandra replied, her voice a strained whisper. But it is getting harder. They are pushing me. Her grandmother gave her a solemn look, nodding as if she understood. Patience, my child, her grandmother said always. The next day, Sabrina upped her game once again, determined to humiliate Sandra in front of the entire school. She arranged for Carly and Beth to sneak into Sandra's locker before classes started, where they stuffed it with crumpled papers covered in crude drawings of green-eyed lizards and cruel insults scribbled in bright ink: lizard girl, snake eyes, creepy creature, and so on. When Sandra opened her locker, the papers tumbled out, scattering across the hallway floor. The other students laughed and pointed, some whispering in amusement, others openly mocking her. Sandra stared at the mess, her vision blurring as anger welled up inside of her. She felt something slithering just beneath her skin, a cold pulsing force, urging her to release it, to let go and strike. But she held back, forcing herself to close her locker calmly, picking up the papers one by one with a strange measured grace. Sabrina watched from the crowd, her arms crossed, a self-satisfying smirk playing on her lips. This was exactly the reaction she had wanted, a display of power over Sandra, a public humiliation that solidified her own dominance. But as Sandra gathered the last of the papers and straightened, she looked up, her eyes locking onto Sabrina's with an intensity that made the queen bee falter for just a moment. For the first time, Sabrina felt a strange chill run down her spine, although she quickly shook it off. But Sandra's gaze lingered, unblinking, unflinching, a quiet warning that went unspoken. Sandra turned and walked away, but inside, she felt something shift. She knew that patience could only stretch so far, that there would come a time when her restraints would snap, and when that moment arrived, Sabrina and her friends would finally see what they had been toying with. As she walked down the hallway, Sandra's hand brushed against her arm, feeling the faint scales that had started to emerge. She was starting to turn to a snake figure. The rain had cleared by afternoon, leaving behind damp, glistening pavements and puddles that reflected the grey sky. Sandra moved through the school's courtyard, her mind focused on her grandmother's words of caution and control. But the laughter that followed her wherever she went was particularly loud today, and she felt an uneasy sense of being watched. Just as she passed the fountain at the center of the schoolyard, she felt a hard shove from behind. She stumbled forward, her shoes splashing into a large puddle, mud splattering up her legs and onto her school bag. The laughter swelled, and she turned. Sabrina was there, standing with a hand on her hip and a look of smug satisfaction on her face. "Look out, ugly girl," Sabrina taunted, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Wouldn't you want to get back into the mud where you belong?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, and her friends, Carly and Beth, cackled in delight, adding their own mocking comments. As they circled her like vultures, Sandra pulled herself up, adjusted her bag, and walked away without a word, ignoring the laughter that echoed behind her. She could feel their eyes on her as she left, but she didn't turn back. Later that day, when the school was emptying out, Sandra slipped around the side of the building, her senses keen, her focus sharp. She had finally had enough, and she was going to teach Sabrina a lesson. She saw Sabrina heading toward the back exit alone, her friends nowhere in sight, leaving her vulnerable and unsuspecting. The late afternoon shadows stretched long across the ground, perfect for hiding. Sandra felt the cold, coiling energy stir inside of her, ready to emerge. And this time, she didn't hold back. She welcomed it. Her transformation into a snake form was swift. She sank into the shadows, her body elongating, her skin cooling, her senses sharpening. As she shed her human form, she moved silently, her serpentine body gliding over the damp grass, her green eyes fixed on her target. Sabrina's back was to her, and Sandra's instinct took over. Every fiber of her being focused on the strike. In one swift, precise movement, Sandra lunged forward, her fangs sinking into Sabrina's exposed ankle. The bite was quick, and the venom took hold almost immediately. Sabrina let out a strangled cry. Stumbling forward, as she felt a sharp burning pain shoot up her leg. She whirled around, her eyes wide with panic, but saw nothing but empty air and shadows. The school grounds were silent as Sabrina clutched her ankle, her breathing racked. She looked down, spotting 2 puncture marks that began to swell, her skin around the bite turning a strange mottled shade. Confusion twisted across her face as the dizziness set in, her vision blurring slightly. She stumbled forward, trying to call out, but her voice came out weak and strangled. Sandra had already vanished, shifting back into the shadows, watching from a distance as Sabrina struggled to stand. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she observed the confusion and the fear that clouded Sabrina's face. It was the first time she had seen the girl shaking, stripped of her usual confidence, and it felt like a small silent victory. By the next morning, Sabrina was absent from school. Her friends whispered about how she had fallen mysteriously ill overnight, her legs swollen and feverish. The doctors at a loss to explain her symptoms. Rumors spread quickly, with students speculating that a poisonous snake might have gotten loose on campus. Others said it was a prank gone wrong, or that Sabrina was faking it to get attention. Sandra sat quietly in the back of the classroom, listening to the theory circulating around her. She maintained her usual calm expression, but inside, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The bite had been a warning, a reminder that she was not as helpless as Sabrina and her friends had assumed. She had her own ways of fighting back, ways that didn't require words or confrontation. Sabrina's absence cast a strange nervous tension over the school. She had been the queen bee, the center of the social scene, and without her, Ali and Beth struggled to keep the same confidence. They whispered to each other about her illness, glancing nervously over their shoulders as though the phantom snake might be lurking nearby. But as the days went on and Sabrina remained out of sight, Carly and Beth seemed to forget their fear, slowly slipping back into old habits. One afternoon, Sandra caught Carly snickering as she passed by, nudging Beth and muttering, "Ugly girl can't be that scary if she just ran off when Sabrina shoot her." They laughed, trying to revive their confidence, and Sandra felt the familiar tingle of anger stirring within her. It was as if they were daring her to remind them, to show them just how wrong they were. She took a breath, steadying herself, allowing her thoughts to coil around an idea as she watched Carly and Beth walk away, oblivious. That evening, Sandra waited until the halls had emptied and only a few students lingered by the exits. Carly, as always, was among the last to leave, lingering as she checked her phone by her locker. Sandra followed her, her footsteps silent, her form blending into the shadows as she let the change take over. She shed her human form, slipping into her snake body, gliding along the floor in complete silence. Carly was too absorbed in her phone to notice the subtle movements near her feet, the flash of green that slipped behind her. Sandra struck quickly, her fangs finding Carly's ankle with precise accuracy. Carly gasped, clutching her legs as a sudden sharp pain blossomed from the bite mark. She looked around, wide-eyed and panicked, but there was no one there, nothing to explain the sting that spread like fire through her veins. The hall was empty. Sandra had already slithered back into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. The next morning, Carly was missing from the class, and the rumors intensified. 2 students now, both from the same friend group, had mysteriously fallen ill with identical symptoms: a high fever, swelling, and strange bite marks on their ankles. Doctors remained baffled, unable to identify the cause. The students grew restless, and whispers of the phantom snake turned into a fearful, hushed conversation between classmates, their glances darting to every shadow as if expecting a serpent to strike at any moment. Beth, the last remaining friend in the trio, looked paler and more frightened by the day. She avoided walking alone, glancing over her shoulder constantly, her face drawn with tension. She sat at the back of the class, huddling in on herself, casting nervous glances all around. Sandra noticed her expression calm, but her eyes unblinking, cool and calculating, as if assessing Beth from a distance. But Bet's fear didn't stop her from making a last desperate attempt to salvage her pride. One afternoon, perhaps emboldened by the other students around her, she muttered to a nearby classmate, "Something is smelling. Can you perceive it too?" Bet held her nose as she insinuated that Sandra was smelling. The comment wasn't loud, but Sandra heard it clearly. She felt a cold satisfaction settle within her as she made a silent promise to herself that Bet would learn too, and she would learn the hard way. That evening, as Bet walked alone to the bus stop, Sandra trailed her, her body silent and fluid as she slipped into her serpent form. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets, and Bet, oblivious in her hurry to reach safety, didn't notice the faint rustle in the bushes beside her, her fangs finding Bet's thigh in the same swift, precise motion, delivering a final warning. Bet let out a strangled scream, clutching her thigh as the same burning pain spread up from the bite mark. She looked around widely, but just like the others, she saw only shadows. By the next morning, the entire school was buzzing with the news. Bet was in the hospital with identical symptoms to Sabrina and Carly. The gist had taken a life of their own, weaving through the school in panicked whispers. Some students claimed they had seen a snake in the school premises. Others swore they had heard hissing in the bathrooms or near the lockers. Sandra sat quietly in the back of her class, her gaze calm as she watched the fear grow. She had made her message clear. She was not someone to be toyed with. The bullies are all in the hospital, written in pain, each one paying the price for their cruelty, although they would never know who or what had truly been responsible, or so Sandra thought. Unknown to Sandra, Sabrina, Carly, and Bet's parents already met, trying to discuss what exactly would be the problem with their kids in the hospital, especially because the three girls had the same symptoms and were not showing any signs of getting better. Also, Sandra didn't know that the last time she transformed into a snake form, Joke, one of the students in the junior class, saw her. While this was going on, the tension in the school settled into a low hum of paranoia. Students glanced nervously at the shadows, keeping their voices low as though afraid of waking some unseen creature. Will Sandra be exposed? Will the bullies get better? Or will this all take a different turn? If you want part 2 of the story, kindly comment "I want part 2" in the comment section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.